I call Derek Ball.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak on the Children and Young Persons and their Families Advocacy Workforce and Age Settings Amendment Bill. New Zealand First will be supporting this bill, sir, and although I acknowledge the issues that the other opposition parties have with this bill, frankly, throughout the whole process from first reading and through the select committee process, New Zealand First has had similar concerns or issues or questions or queries around pretty much that same provision around the delegations, sir. But there's a key difference or key reason why New Zealand First is supporting this bill, and I think what I feel obliged to do, sir, is to go through the 5 aims of this bill and explain why New Zealand First supports 4 out of the 5 and has an issue with 1 of them. The main reason why New Zealand First is supporting this bill is because of what it does, sir. So the issues that have been brought forward by the opposition parties are about how the government or the ministry intends to achieve that what. That's the problems that the opposition parties have. But New Zealand First is concentrating on what will happen when this legislation passes, sir. And the main aim is to achieve a child-centred system. And the first way it does that is by extending the state responsibility for care and protection to a person's 18th birthday. And that's what we know as a party. We want to stand up in their house and support and ensure that goes through in legislation. Now, there may be some issues with, or caveats with the other 4 ways in which the government wants to achieve that aim, sir, but that can't diminish the need for the help, the care and protection for those, to include those 17-year-olds. The second aim, sir, is to encourage the participation of children and young people in decisions that could significantly affect them, and New Zealand First supports that. It wants to ensure that wherever possible, policies and services have regard to the views of children and young people, and New Zealand First supports that aim, sir. It aims to support the setup of independent advocacy services with a particular focus on children and young people and care. New Zealand First agrees with that, sir. But the one aim and issue and method that we have an issue with, sir, and concern is that the government aims to allow a broader range of professionals to perform a wider set of tasks to help identify and meet the needs of vulnerable children and young people. And we've heard both sides of the argument in this House. We've heard the government and the minister stand up saying this is a great thing because professionals from outside of the scope can be employed to help the social workers or to help care for the children. And we've also heard from the other opposition parties that this can be manipulated, and because of the ambiguity with which the legislation is written, it is a very subjective provision, and that's the problem. It is a very subjective provision. And I would hazard a guess that if it was a Labour government or if it was a Greens government, they probably wouldn't have that much of an issue with that provision because they feel that they would have the right perspective with which to use that provision, sir. They are just judging the current government and the perception of the current government and how they would use that. And New Zealand First does have concerns with that as well, sir, because of the ambiguity. But one of the reasons why there's a little bit of confusion with why the government wants to allow the delegation of non-qualified individuals is because there's legislation going through the House, or it will do shortly, with the mandatory registration for social workers. And the whole intent of ensuring social workers are mandatorily registered is to ensure a few things, sir, and that's to ensure that the quality and standard of training, the quality and standard of performance for those social workers, the actual robustness of the roles and the intent of the individual social workers, that they're appropriately qualified, and basically that the safety of the children are at the centre, which, funnily enough, is the intent of this legislation, sir. So why would we have the structure and the process that social workers needed to be mandatorily registered to ensure the quality of that service? Not only the quality, but having the right people doing the right job and for the right reasons, sir. Why would we want to have that, or why would the government need to stipulate that for social workers, and yet, in this context, allow that delegation to go out the window, sir? And I'd just like to highlight how ambiguous the actual legislation is, sir, by reading out just one of the clauses in the legislation, section 7C, number 2, and this is where it stipulates about where the chief executive does delegate to those people who are not registered social workers. And that states that whoever that chief executive chooses, sir, that chief executive must be satisfied that the person is appropriately qualified to perform the function or exercise the power, taking into account the person's training, experience and interpersonal skills. And that quite obviously is a very subjective paragraph there, sir. The second point is that that doesn't actually rule out the concerns that New Zealand First has with this and other opposition parties. That doesn't rule out the use of private companies or the entire privatisation of that role, sir. Does it rule out the use of Serco, for example? And the answer is no. Another point that I'd actually like to make on that little piece that I read out, sir, is the fact that at the moment there is consultation going on in regards to family violence and about the workforce capability framework and the necessity for anyone that does that role, works within those roles, to ensure that they have some core competencies. And the question is, does this bill and that legislation, part of the legislation that I read out, does that apply to the core competencies, or does it include the essential core competencies within the framework? And I'd just like to read it out, sir, where it states that the Ministerial Group on Family Violence and Sexual Violence work program is inviting consultation on the draft, and the purpose of the framework is to outline the core capabilities that members of the workforce need to have to effectively deliver family and sexual violence services and to better collaborate and coordinate with each other. So if you compare the need for the social workers to be registered, sir, the need for people who work within the family violence sector to ensure that they have core capabilities, surely there needs to be some sort of need within this, one of the most important parts of any legislation that goes through their house, which is working with our vulnerable children, sir, to have some sort of structure and certainty on who we have, what jobs they are going to be performing and for what reasons, sir. So, although we do quite clearly have some issues and concerns with one specific part of the legislation, sir, we will be supporting this legislation. We will be supporting this bill through. And we will because we know that in the main part, if we don't support this bill, then in principle, we will be asking to support the status quo, or asking to accept the status quo, where 17-year-olds can't get that help, care and protection. And I would I feel confident, sir, that when New Zealand First is in government next year, this could quite well be one of the pieces of legislation that will be pulled out, and that will could quite well be one of the pieces of the legislations and the provision within that legislation that we will have a very, very close look at. We will be supporting this bill, sir, with some reservations and concerns.